Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kavit Hathaway. The figures are astounding when it comes to the total amount pumped into the U.S. economy since the financial crisis hit. But 3 years on and now entering the fourth year, the situation still looks grim for the United States, with rescued banks facing bankruptcy again, not to mention U.S. cities, while the rich keep getting richer.
More American banks are in danger of collapsing, even after receiving aid from the federal government. The economy has done little to improve the financial conditions of many struggling institutions. An analysis of government data by the Wall Street Journal suggests 98 bailed-out banks are again on the verge of collapse. It means the number of troubled financial institutions have increased by 15% only during the summer. Altogether, the banks had received $4.2 billion under the government's Troubled Asset Relief Program in the heat of the financial crisis. 7 of the bailed-out banks have already collapsed, costing taxpayers a loss of $2.7 billion. The debt crisis is also threatening to spark a municipal meltdown. Research analyst Meredith Whitney says more than 100 American cities could go bankrupt in 2011. Among them are Detroit and San Francisco, and states like Illinois, Florida, and Arizona. American cities and states in total have debts as much as $2 trillion as they spend billions more than what they had collected in taxes. Many cities are struggling to even pay for providers of basic services such as street cleaning. The financial crisis has also deepened the gap between poor and rich to unprecedented levels. A study by think tank Economic Policy Institute says the richest American households have 225 times as much money as the average families. The gap is the largest since the survey began some 5 decades ago. Although most Americans hold the former Bush administration responsible for their economic troubles, many also put the blame on the Obama government for not doing enough to get the economy back on track. With both parties blaming each other for the country's economic woes, the big question for most Americans is whether the White House and Capitol Hill can work together to stimulate the economy.
Some astounding figures there. Let's try to make some sense out of it. Financial journalist Max Keiser joins us from Paris, and we have investigative journalist Wayne Madsen joining us from Washington. Thank you both for joining us. Let me start off with Wayne Madsen. You have troubled banks, and then the rescue comes in the form of TARP or the bailouts, and then these banks are now facing bankruptcy again. Why hasn't the bailout worked?
Well, I think it's a mere fact that President Obama surrounded himself in his administration. All these economic advisors came out mostly from Goldman Sachs. This is one of the companies that's responsible for this economic meltdown. So he's getting his advice from people who are part of the problem and not people who could solve this problem. We have a President Obama who should be doing what Franklin Roosevelt did and using the bully pulpit of the White House, not to have little teas and luncheons with CEOs, but to be giving them orders. He's the President of the United States, and he's basically allowing the Wall Street fat cats to dictate the policy. And the policy, we see how it's working out. Today, we're told that 50 million Americans, up 10 million, are now without health insurance. What was that Obamacare all about? All that was something crafted by the Wall Street, the insurance companies on Wall Street, the big pharma, the big HMOs, and this is what we're left with, more people uninsured because, again, that policy was crafted by people who are very close to these Wall Street barons and tycoons.
Max Keiser, same question to you.
Well, I think if you take a step back and look at the big picture here, you have to understand that the American economic and monetary policies are structured in a way where the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank is looking at asset prices and trying to stimulate asset prices, as opposed to looking at jobs and trying to stimulate jobs. So all he looks at are those house prices. He's trying to get those house prices up by flooding the economy with more money. But every time he floods the economy with more money, more debt actually, the banks turn around and they say, oh, we just discovered another $1 or $2 trillion in bad debt that we had kept off our balance sheet. And therefore, that money just ends up circulating on Wall Street, making a lot of people on Wall Street a lot of money. Now, during this period of time, the Fed's balance sheet has expanded by many trillions of dollars and is set to expand by many more trillions of dollars as this catastrophe continues to unfold. But at its core, at its root, is the fundamental question of whether the policymakers in Washington are there to promote and help asset prices or whether they're there to promote jobs. And they've decided to promote asset prices, and specifically houses, and to sacrifice jobs. And when you sacrifice jobs, you sacrifice savings, you sacrifice capital formation, and you sacrifice much of what has held the economy together for a long, long time. So they basically are sacrificing the economy, trying to stimulate the housing market and the speculation in the housing market.
Well, one of the ways that jobs do get created is what the U.S. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner said, Wayne Madsen, and this is in regards to the banks, that the bank bailouts will bring capital back into the financial system so that banks could lend again. But then the stats come out that the U.S. bank lending has fallen at the fastest rate in history. So what are the banks doing with the money?
Well, that's a good question, and I know Max has been on this for as long as I've heard him, the financial terrorists on Wall Street. You know, they're saying, small businesses. We're told small businesses create most of the jobs, but we hear that small businesses can't get the credit from the banks to even think about creating more jobs, employing more people, new startups. So all this is, in my opinion, it's some sort of weird alchemy that's going on Wall Street where, they're trying to create something, but we see nothing. We don't see jobs being created. I know I spoke to somebody in northern Alabama yesterday. Unemployment there is at 33%. It's so bad. Young people graduating from high school have no other choice but to join the military. Well, that's pretty good for the Pentagon and its recruiting numbers. It also creates more cannon fodder for these senseless wars the United States is engaged in overseas. But it does nothing to create jobs. And I remember President Obama was in India. He said, exporting jobs to India will create more jobs in the United States. I don't know what planet this guy is from, but that's not creating more jobs. That's exporting mostly white-collar, high-tech jobs to places like India. And we see this across the board with this administration's policy, which is more concerned about the interests of Wall Street than the interests of Main Street. And we see what's happening to Main Street. We know that I talked to a top consultant to the Democratic Party, and he threw his hands up and said, no, there's going to be, he verified there's going to be city after city, county after county, and state after state declaring bankruptcy. Their bonds are going to be junk rated, and what we're going to see is what's happening in Europe now with Greece and Ireland and Spain and France and other countries happening right here in the United States, state by state and city by city.
Max Keiser, why is that happening? Why is it that there's these municipal defaults that are leading to over 100 cities, at the last count, facing possible bankruptcy next year?
Let me just go back for a second. Again, talking about the Geithner comment that he's trying to create jobs. And, of course, the Treasury and the Fed created quantitative easing 1 and quantitative easing 2. The latest round of quantitative easing putting something like $650 billion into the economy. But this money goes into the banks, and the reason it doesn't go into the general economy is because the banks at the same time suddenly disclose that we have another $1 trillion in bad debts tied to the real estate market. And by the way, they can't get the real estate market going because they're embroiled in a massive foreclosure fraud where banks sold, like Bank of America, sold trillions of dollars worth of fraudulent mortgages throughout the system, which is yet another layer of debt. So this colossal debt monster keeps unfolding, and it gets larger and larger. And to get to your question about municipalities and states, they're simply just going bankrupt because the people have lost their jobs. There's no tax base, and they're shrinking. And also, if you look at some of the investigative reporting that's been done by folks like Matt Taibbi over there at Rolling Stone, he did a fantastic report last year about how the banks on Wall Street, like the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans, have gone into these municipalities, constructed debt for equity swaps, destroyed their local economies, left them with 10 times more debt than they had to begin with, and then left town, leaving these poor counties on the hook for all this debt just to create fees for the banks on Wall Street, who, by the way, are going to be enjoying record bonuses again this year, more than $140 billion, record bonuses in the face of the 50 million people now don't have health insurance and the record poverty rates and all the rest of it in the U.S. That shows that the U.S. is really sliding down to a second world, third world status.
Let me bring in Dr. Roger von Hanwehr from New York. He's the managing director of Arcxeon International to get another angle to this. Dr. von Hanwehr, we talked about the banks, the possibility of them facing bankruptcy again. These are the troubled banks. And we talked about the cities facing bankruptcy also. Now, doesn't this mean that it's defaulting on loans? And if it does, then where was the oversight? I mean, loans were given. Shouldn't there have been a careful look at their, well, to start off with their ledgers to see what the payables and receivables were, what their assets were? Where did the oversight come in?
Well, certainly from the standpoint of recent loans, the bank failures are only partially due to those. Many of those are reprocessed loans in regional areas of the U.S. where there's great economic weakness, and the underlying reasons why loans default, which include unemployment, lack of monetary velocity in the economy, and just an inadequate level of infusion of capital into the circulating consumer exchange elements of the economy at the bottom tier. Those loans will always be bad in those regions. There's a massive dumping of foreclosures on the market. Home prices are plummeting for the fourth month in a row, and thus these loans essentially cannot be improved upon. And these were loans that were not in the worst class, or not considered to be in the worst class of loan statures during the 2008 crisis. So these loans essentially cannot be absorbed by the system. But the underlying weakness of the banks is that the monetary infusion that the Fed undertook to bolster the major banks in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and elsewhere did not trickle down to the smaller banks. You asked the question earlier, what happened to all this infusion of capital? And the answer is it seeks maximum returns. So one of the reasons we have low monetary velocity in the U.S. is that much of the infused capital makes its way into bubbles on foreign markets in emerging economies. It leaves the United States rather rapidly. With respect to industry, with respect to hedge funds, with respect to other concentrations of capital, endowments, and so on, they are hoarding capital. They are unwinding positions on Wall Street, and they are essentially maintaining their reserves either in cash, in gold, or in fixed assets such as real estate. So one of the reasons that you see these problems with the medium and small tier banks is the infusion of capital from the bailouts is not making its way down to the fundamental bottom tier of the consumer economy.